Hello, 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 and happy Wednesday. How's everybody feeling today? Hopefully good. Just making sure everybody's getting on okay. Looks like we're tuning in. That's great. So welcome everyone to another episode of Let's Talk About Shh. It's a live podcast where we talk about love, intimacy, and relationships and everything connected to that. So, who am I? I am Tila. I'm a sex educator, relationship expert, and published author. I love helping people connect and, learn about sex and relationships and how to improve their relationships and get the most out of their sex life. This is a topic that is so taboo for so many people, and it really shuts a lot of people down. And I love helping people connect with that part of themselves. So if you're joining us for the very first time, we do have some guidelines. As I mentioned, this is a live podcast, which means that your comments and thoughts and ideas and feedback matters. We are broadcasting live to Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. And your comments, should you choose to make any, will pop up in the feed. So play nice with other people. And if somebody calls in, we also accept live callers. So if somebody calls in with a question, please don't shame them or make them feel badly if they ask something that you think everybody should know. Lots of people have different levels of experience and knowledge when it comes to sex and relationships, and we want this to be a fun environment for everybody. So please be supportive. Okay, so open up the phone lines now. If you want to call in with a thought or idea or comment or question or advice or anything, you can reach us at 1-877-777-5589. It's completely toll free. And if you want to call in about something that's not about the topic of today's show, please do. We can always go back to the topic after we address your question. So, how is everyone today? I hope you're all doing great. We've got a really important topic today. So this week we are going with the whole theme of gender equality and sexism. And yesterday we did sexual objectification, which I thought was pretty great. And the feedback was really good. People seem to really like it. So thank you for commenting. Today's keeping busy at work. Yeah, I hear you. Work is always busy, right? So today's topic, in line talking about gender equality and sexism, is on toxic masculinity. Now, this is, as I said, a pretty important episode because toxic masculinity is definitely, has definitely become a real buzzword. And people have some pretty strong reactions to it, understandably so. And there's also a lot of different interpretations as to what that actually means. And the word and its use, just like other words like feminism, has been misused by many different people and twisted and all sorts of things. So, we're going to talk about what it means, why it's important we should talk about it, what's the difference between toxic masculinity and masculinity? Is there a difference? We're going to talk about all those things because they're really important, okay? So, most people don't know this, but the term toxic masculinity actually goes back to about, I think it was the early 80s. And it was actually first used in male-only workshops. And, the men would get together in groups and they go on wilderness retreats and drumming circles and that sort of thing. And they would talk about the term toxic masculinity. And it was used in opposition to what they referred as sort of like a deep masculine, or what was seen as more of like a protective warrior definition of what masculinity was meant to be. And that's sort of where the term originated. And it's only been in recent years that it's gained more traction. You're seeing it more and people are talking more about the idea of toxic masculinity. And, today the word is used to describe a variety of behaviors and ideals that stand in the way of gender equality or promote sexism. So this can include such concepts like, real men can't or don't express emotions. Any man who does is not considered a man. That men should always mask or suppress their emotions. And that men should maintain this appearance of hardness. Real man is hard and the strong, silent type. And, that sort of goes hand in hand with the idea that men being strong have to, you know, enforce their dominance. And this is usually through violence, because violence through the eyes of toxic masculinity is an indicator of power and how a man can exert control over a person or situation. And if they can't do that, they're seen as feminine or weak or not a real man. And there's this real concept that, a man can't be strong and feminine. If he has any feminine qualities, that's bad. And there's also this idea of strength being tied to dominance, virility, and violence. So, I'm sure you guys have seen it as well, but the concept of toxic masculinity is often pointed to when we look at rates of domestic violence, misogyny, and it's sort of become this catch-all term for general bad behavior from men. So it's really important to note that while a set of beliefs and ideals that align with toxic masculinity, there's other factors that go into a lot of these issues. Things like rape culture, mental health, whether there's support, someone has a support system or good models. There's can be things like substance misuse. There's all different kinds of factors that play into, things like domestic violence and stuff like that. Domestic violence in particular, there's so many different causes. We can't point to toxic masculinity and be like, well, that's the problem right there, sums it all up. It might be definitely one of the contributing factors or an attribute of a situation, but it's not the cause of every issue of bad behavior. It just might be a sign of underlying attitudes that can be problematic or make a situation worse. Does that make sense? So obviously there's a lot of strong objection to the term of toxic masculinity, and most of the time this stems from the idea or stems from the perception that when we say toxic masculinity, we really mean all masculinity, or that all masculinity and all men are inherently toxic. This is completely incorrect. That is not what is meant by the term or what is meant by the use of the term. And not only that, but if it was, it would be a serious disservice to men. It basically implies that men are not capable of being good people. And that's not true. There are plenty of things that men do well, and not all behavior from men or masculinity is inherently toxic. I think one of the main issues that surround this and cause a lot of these perceptual misunderstandings is that there are so many different definitions of what makes a man. And these things are always changing. They're always changing throughout history. It's usually often quite ambiguous for men. If you look back in history, for example, there's a time where it was considered incredibly manly, the epitome of masculinity, to wear heels, a wig, and makeup. Obviously, some of those ideals have changed. It's no longer considered manly in today's society to do that. So this constant change over the centuries of what masculinity is meant to look like and what we are told masculinity is meant to look like causes this sort of ambiguous feeling as what is it? What does masculinity mean? And we're going to talk about a little bit about the opposition of this toxic femininity tomorrow, but I think it's a little harder for toxic masculinity because unlike femininity, a lot of feminine virtues have not morphed quite as dramatically over time. They have definitely changed, but it's not as ambiguous for many people as masculinity is. And so when we have a lot of different ideas, different perceptions, and they don't match, they're always changing, it causes some stress, right? So we just have a comment that says a lot of musical friends are male and feel this way. I admit that I didn't feel right. Oh, sorry, the comment disappeared before I managed to finish. That it didn't approach it right at first because I was annoyed with the macho vibes, but I love how they showed me their heart. That's great. Yeah, it's a lot of men really struggle with how to show those emotions and what's socially acceptable, because like I said, those rules are changing all the time, and it makes it really ambiguous and confusing for a lot of men, and for many women too, actually. So, I mean, there's a psychotherapist, Hannalee Vera. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but she, when exploring the ideas of toxic masculinity, she noted that it's actually more of a sign of lack of self-worth and self-respect. That underneath all that instability and anger is someone who is wounded, who was never taught to value his authentic and genuine experience of himself. And I have to say, I kind of agree with that assessment. I mean, when there's all this ambiguity about who you want to be, and when there's many examples out there of how men should not be, particularly in today's society. The thing is, each generation sort of looks to their father and sees how their father was. And many men have said, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be a father like that. I don't want to be a husband like that. I want to treat the world differently. So we're constantly redefining what that is. And that comes with a lot of insecurity, because people want to be well thought of. They want to be well respected. They want to be seen as a man. Right? Especially in a society where being seen as a man is incredibly important. There's still many societies that are patriarchal, that view men as more valuable than women. There's so many ways that we devalue women. We sort of talked about that yesterday in sexual objectification. So being seen as a man can be even more important, right? And that sort of gets all messed up with the feelings of insecurity, with the feelings of uncertainty. And, we're left with this sort of mess of what is masculinity. And there's a big difference between toxic masculinity and masculinity. In today's society, masculinity is being redefined to give men more freedom, more emotional freedom to develop as people. Men should have that freedom to form meaningful, emotional, and deep relationships with other people aside from their romantic partner. There's a lot of really good books out there that talk about, the bonding that men do. And a lot of it, the terminology that comes up is sort of like the boy code. I don't know, have you guys ever heard of the boy code before? Heard that terminology? And many young men who have been interviewed feel that they have to adhere very strongly to this boy code, or be ridiculed by their peers or rejected by their peers. And they don't know how to form those emotional attachments without following that sort of boy code, so to speak. And so, I recently had somebody say to me that, he was upset that toxic masculinity, and we were sort of talking about that subject or that topic, and he said that he was upset that he felt that women were redefining masculinity, and he felt that it was something that men should do. I said, well, men are doing it, for starters. Many men have had a voice in what that is, but the prevailing opinion at this time is that masculinity is also being redefined to take away that element of violence. There's no need to be violent in order to be seen as strong, and there's no need to be dominant in order to be seen as a man or strong. Which I think is a very interesting concept. And it's important too that we realize that, like so many other things, this is not black and white. there is no such thing as one type of masculinity. That's like saying there's only one shade of blue. That's it. Only one shade. There isn't. There's a whole spectrum of shade of blues, and masculinity is no different. There's a wide range of how masculinity can be healthy and how it can be presented as healthy, and somebody can be incredibly wonderful. I mean, if you're looking for some positive examples of masculinity, one that people often talk about is Mr. Rogers. Wonderful man, undoubtedly masculine, wonderful, soft and strong, right? Actually there's a meme that I don't know if you guys have seen it. I post it periodically, but different examples of toxic masculinity, and one that I really like actually is the character in Black Panther, the movie that came out a little while ago. I think it was last year. Anyway, if you haven't seen it, great movie, but also some really good examples of positive masculinity that does not adhere to those sort of negative and potentially troubling aspects where men have to be overly violent, or men have to be withholding in their emotions, or can't form attachments, or can't talk about their emotions. But at the same time, they can still be some of those traditionally masculine traits. A lot of men also reject the notion of toxic masculinity because they feel that women are trying to redefine masculinity to make men feminine. And it's not about making men feminine. It is about expanding the definition so that men who are more feminine are not seen as less than a man, There's still room for that more traditional, I was going to say vision, but that's not the right word, more that traditional aspect of masculinity. No one's trying to take that away, I mean, some people, I do have a meme that I post, and it's a picture of sort of like a warrior type kind of gentleman, and he's in the woods, and it looks very traditionally masculine, and it says something to the effect of a man doesn't protect a woman because she needs it. He protects her because she's important. And I recently had somebody say that meme made them really uncomfortable because it's reinforcing those concepts of toxic masculinity, and I have to disagree. There is room for some of those traditional ideals. They're not going to appeal to everybody, and they shouldn't appeal to everybody. Not everyone is going to want that or need to be that. But masculinity, there's room in the definition of masculinity for those ideals. It is a spectrum, just like so many other things. I realized I sort of talked through that really fast. So does anybody want to comment on that, or if you guys have any thoughts about it? About masculinity? What you feel like masculinity is for you? Well, yeah, it's saying really loving the perspective of masculinity as a spectrum. Totally agree. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know why people feel the need to paint everything so black and white. It doesn't have to be black and white, and obviously, like, a black and white world is never going to be quite right. Maybe it looks right in art, but the real world is full of color, right? So I don't think we need to limit ourselves into one type. What they say, different strokes for different folks. I mean, normally that applies to sexual orientation, but I like to think it applies to a lot of things. But yeah, so I So I wanted to really hammer in that idea of the difference between toxic masculinity and masculinity, just because it's something that people really struggle with. And it's one of the major objections to the term. I understand that the term is a little bit abrasive for some people, and if you're not aware of the meaning and the context, can be some people are highly insulted by the use of the term toxic. But in the wrong context, literally anything can be toxic if it's taken in the wrong context. So it's an important thing to remember. Context is always very important. I also have to acknowledge that unfortunately there are people out there who do see toxic masculinity and masculinity as the same thing, of course. Unfortunately, there are radicals in every group. So yeah, don't always listen to the voice of extreme radicals. Often people who are saying things like that are usually people who have been deeply hurt and are carrying a lot of trauma. So yeah, so just be aware of that. I think that we're at a very interesting time for men. I say that because there's so many things that are happening in the world right now, and there's so many different conversations. And with things like Me Too happening in the last few years, and just other sort of issues related to sexism and gender, and the rise of, interest in using terms like toxic masculinity, I think it is a fantastic opportunity for men to redefine how other people see them. Men have always been, at least for our recent history being a few centuries, men have been the dominant group. We, of course, live in a patriarchal society, and there are many men, especially in the younger generations, who are rejecting, the notions of previous generations. Like I said earlier, looking at their fathers and being like, I don't want to be that type of man. And I think it's really interesting that many of those men are not fighting. Many of those men are not fighting the notion of toxic masculinity. They tend to latch on to the understanding of it because they've seen examples. It's usually the people who have no basics for experience or have not had that thought of, no, I don't want to be like the generations before me for whatever reason. And it's really a different type of journey for everyone. If you come across someone who is extremely resistant to the notion of toxic masculinity, it's probably because they're seeing it as being defined as all masculinity, because they have not witnessed toxic masculinity, which honestly I doubt, or they just don't recognize it because there's no context for them to recognize it. So it's important to just remember to be patient with people. Everybody's on their different journey. Everybody's at a different stage of learning, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's important that we give people space to learn and grow and make mistakes. That's actually something I think we want to talk about next week is cancel culture, because that's a whole thing. But yeah, so it's important we give people time and space and understanding. And if you're not particularly ready to do the emotional labor of explaining what that means and how that impacts people, and the potential influences on things like domestic violence and so on and so forth, or even how it contributes to sexual objectification and sexism, point them my way. I will happily do that emotional labor as an educator. That is what I do. Lots and lots of emotional labor as far as that goes. But it's important. And, the more we have these conversations, the better it's going to get, because the more it's going to make people think, and then the more it'll make people question. And stopping to question your beliefs is not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean your beliefs are always going to be inherently wrong, but it is always good to stop and take a critical eye at certain things, because that is ultimately how we grow as people, and how we deepen our understanding. And also how we further conversations about abstract topics like masculinity and toxic masculinity. There's a really excellent documentary, and it's called The Masks We Wear. Last time I checked, unfortunately, it was not available on any of the streaming services. I saw it, I think, 2 or 3 years ago now. Anyway, it's really excellent. It talks a lot about definitions of masculinity, and also, the boy code, and things that men endure often without complaint or without fighting it, and the problems that actually entails for men. And this is one of the side effects of toxic masculinity, is when men are isolated from their emotions and isolated from other people, they feel incredibly alone. And that is one of the things that actually greatly impacts men's mental health. Men are the number one group, particularly young men. Actually, no, they're not the number one. I take that back, sorry. Trans teens are actually the number one suicide risk. But men also have an extremely high rate, or extremely high suicide risk, and also risk of mental health, depression, anxiety, and isolation. And a lot of that has to do with the idea of bottling emotions and not connecting with people, even their romantic partners, to a certain extent. So it is important that we get men to open up. If you or anyone you know is experiencing some of that anxiety, there is a really great website. It's Man Up Against Suicide. It has a whole bunch of resources for people who may be struggling. And I will be sure to include that in my write-up for this episode as well. So you can check that out on my website. Yeah. How's everybody feeling? I know sometimes these heavy topics are really hard to digest, and it's not exactly the quickest thing. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions about, men's mental health, how it relates to toxic masculinity, the difference between toxic masculinity and masculinity? Enjoying the talk so far? Good. That's sort of all the points I actually really wanted to cover, to be honest. We could talk a little bit more about men's mental health, which is a very important topic. I'm a firm believer that mental health and the state of mental health is actually what ties a lot into issues like domestic violence. And I know many people feel very strongly that, it's a tricky thing. We definitely want to be able to support survivors, but we also have to look at how we can break patterns of domestic violence. And I'm a very, very firm believer that in breaking those patterns, we need to strengthen our mental health supports. Because if we don't, and we can't get people who perpetuate domestic violence to either seek help, get help, or connect with people about those issues, they're just going to continue to perpetuate those problems. And it's a very complex issue. And this is, sort of where ideas like toxic masculinity tie in, because they do impact things like mental health. So it's all very layered, and challenging to disentangle. Yeah, okay. Well, I think we'll end there today. So tomorrow we're going to be continuing on. Oops, I'm sorry, I have the date wrong there. It says next show the 17th, but today is the 17th. Oops. Next show, tomorrow's the 18th. Woo! So tomorrow we're actually going to be talking about toxic femininity, which is actually not something that's talked about very often, but is also a very important subject to sexism and gender equality. So make sure to tune in that for tomorrow. Please share this episode, like, subscribe, tell somebody about it. And if you're looking for more resources, please check out my website, exploresextalk.com. There is tons of free articles on there, as well as a paid membership, Sexy Hero Society, which will give you access to extra awesome content every month. In fact, we publish something new almost every week. So anyway, thank you guys so much for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Like I said, please share. This podcast is available for replay on YouTube. You can also download a copy off of Podbean, Spotify, or iTunes and Google Play. And yeah, thank you guys so much. And you guys, I hope everybody has a fantastic night, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.